Hello, I'm Richard Webb, Senior Analyst in the Research and Media team in TM Forum, and I'll be hosting today's webinar, which focuses on turning too much data from a challenge to an opportunity. I'm joined by guest speaker, Matt Olson from Splunk. So I'd like to say, first of all, hello, Matt. Thank you very much for joining us. Maybe we can start off by just asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your role and about Splunk in general.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I'm Matt Olson, industry advisor and strategist for comms and media. So really focused on using Splunk as a platform to meet the needs of service providers. And coming out of 2-3 decades working in the industry and many years in this role, seen quite a lot of change and transformation in the industry. And a bit about Splunk. So Splunk is a data platform bringing in data of essentially any structure via essentially any transport mechanism, really focused on machine data, and making that data available in near real time to ensure resilient, performant, and secure systems. So really, it's about bringing together data and bringing it to bear to solve the problems of the industry.
Okay, very good. Well, welcome, Matt. So we're going to be having a long discussion through the webinar today. And so I'll be bringing Matt back in later on in the webinar. But before we dive into our discussion, I'm just going to run through a few slides to reference some of the research that the Research and Media Unit within TM Forum has been participating in and delivering. And just to sort of set the scene and give some context. So one of the reports that I'm going to reference particularly is one that we released earlier this year, but is still very much relevant. And it's all focused on data and specifically exploiting data to drive strategies. And honestly, having come back from our DTW show, our Digital Transformation World event in Copenhagen recently, every single conversation came back to data at some point. It's really fundamental to anything, whether that's automating networks or integrating Gen AI. It really does all have its foundation in data. So the report itself, you can find it in form.tmforum.org. If you registered for this webinar, we will send out a link to that, but you can download it directly, as well as the slides from today. So no need to screenshot anything, but the report itself looks at various aspects of data, the data-centric strategy for service providers. What does that really mean? Leveraging AI and automation, as I mentioned, and cloud native capabilities, and how those really provide that kind of that foundation for leveraging data. Enhancing network visibility, and Matt and I are going to be talking about that in particular a bit later on, and how that plays a critical role in getting the most out of data. And then using it really as a facet for efficiency, and what that means in terms of sustainability as one of those kind of key efficiency metrics. Next slide, please. So, it's a well-known phenomenon now that service providers have a huge amount of data as a manifestation of the huge amounts of traffic that's traversing their networks. And what that means in terms of data sources is there's a increasing number of internal and external pools of knowledge that are coming across service provider networks. And we've listed some of those on screen there. I'm not going to go through all of them individually, but there's various sources of that data, which could be business systems, operations, support systems, the network itself, and various IT systems within the operator, financial and business systems generating lots of data, of course. And then there's all those businesses that the service providers connected to, their solution providers, partners, supply chain channels, and so on, as well as our own employees' activities, even things like email, for example, generating data. Their customers, those interactions, actually very important data, because it tells the service provider a lot about how services are being consumed, and that user behavior can be utilized to improve and create new services. and so on. And of course, social media, which is one way service providers can understand what their customers are thinking about them. But with all that data, a wealth and a potential richness comes some significant challenges. Next slide, please. So through the research that we did, and as with all the research within the research and media team, TM Forum, our research is really founded on what our community of service providers are telling us. So our research in the report that I mentioned kind of brings all those challenges to a series of conclusions, but one of them was really the need for a holistic approach from CSPs in order to leverage their data. And that meant several different things, but it really meant kind of breaking down different silos of data, some of those that we just referred to, that can be created by different parts of the business or different functions within the operator, so that those data flows can kind of add to each other and become greater than the sum of their parts. But saying it and doing it is very much a difficult thing, and that's something Matt and I are certainly going to be chatting a little bit more. But that holistic approach not just kind of incorporates how operators think about their data, but it kind of goes down to how they architect their infrastructure, how they organize themselves as a business, how they do business and interact with customers and so on. So that holistic approach really is very all-encompassing. Next slide, please. Part of that holistic approach, as I mentioned, started with infrastructure and the architecture that is going to be supporting that data strategy. And again, one of the strong conclusions from our research was the role of cloud native architecture in furthering that data strategy. And there's various options there for a service provider, some of which you can see on the right there: public, private, hybrid, multi-cloud, although there are some sort of sub nuances that can be gleaned as well. But these are the kind of basic options. Matt, maybe I can bring you in here. I think it's quite an easy assumption that cloud native architecture is vital, but how you do it and when you do it actually varies greatly from operator to operator. How does Splunk view the role of cloud native as that foundation for data?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the first thing that is abundantly clear is that cloud native architectures unlock a lot of really new exciting capabilities in terms of direct access to relevant data and true observability for processes, which can be both in the traditional BSS realm with microservices, and now more and more network as network is moving to cloud native. And so I think the first thing is that the shift to cloud native architectures really unlocks observability in more of a real-time fashion, in a fine-grained fashion, to understand what's happening with critical processes. And that includes some new data types, like the ability to do tracing and instrumentation on microservices applications. The other thing, though, that's abundantly clear is, this unlocks a tremendous amount of data, higher velocity, higher variety, a lot more visibility into what's happening with these critical processes. But of course, as we'll touch on later, this introduces a lot of challenges and a need for a fundamentally new approach to the data analytics and the management of these processes. I think the other thing that's really key, though, is what you've touched on here, is there are a variety of architectures. And cloud native doesn't mean necessarily moving everything to public cloud. Private hybrid architectures are absolutely key for controls, security, frankly, the economics. The ability to move from private into the hybrid and public models, I think, is key. And the other thing that's abundantly clear is that this is a transformation which is unfolding at a rapid pace, but there is a long legacy trail, and there's a lot that remains on-prem, and much of it in traditional architectures. Yeah. So in my mind, the three key takeaways, I think, are the cloud native unlocks tremendous new capabilities, both in terms of visibility to the data and frankly, automation and orchestration.
Yeah.
But it needs to be supported in a context which encompasses, a variety of architectures from on-prem, private cloud, hybrid and public. And, the third thing is that this then really, I think, drives an architecture that needs to encompass both cloud native and traditional in an integrated fashion, because it's moving at a rapid clip, but with a long, long legacy tail. This is going to take quite a while, I think, to unfold.
Yeah, and that's something that comes across in our research. There's no one silver bullet. There's no perfect scenario that's going to work for all operators. They're all in their own individual scenarios. So, figuring out not only what they need now, but how to evolve that cloud native strategy is a key thing, and that's where I think the solutions provider community has a significant role to play there. Okay. So let's think about some of the challenges of data. And if I could put the next slide up, we've talked about the huge volume of data and coming in from all these different sources, but perhaps it's worth kind of breaking that down in terms of what that means, because it's actually a quite complex combination of challenges in having that data and knowing what to do with it if you're going to turn it from these challenges into opportunities. So, in having that volume of data from different sources, it's not always clean, it's not always consistent and usable data. It's coming in from all different sources in different formats. That means it's hard to work to a common data model. And then understanding the context of that data, where it was captured, what it relates to, how it can be related to other data as well. How do you see some of those challenges that we've put up there, Matt?
Yeah, so I think you could start with sort of the simplest and I think best understood challenge, which is simply accommodating the massive volume and frankly the higher velocity of data as you have more and more data generated in a real-time fashion. But I think that's well understood. That's a scaling challenge. It's critically important. But I think also it's the variety of data, because to be really effective working with data, we've moved well beyond a model of strict schema-defined static data types. So to really do this effectively, you need to work with a wide variety of data structures, including, frankly, unstructured and semi-structured data. And in a world in which data structures are continually in flux, and there's quite a bit of variety across different data sources. So I think the first thing that's really key is that there tends to be a focus on the kind of the end of the pipeline and AI and ML and the amazing things you can do with data and on the volume of data. But to really be effective, you need to address the full pipeline. And that means really understanding what's required to process this data, transform it, frankly, clean it and monitor it. Monitoring of data pipelines is about as important as the data pipelines themselves. And so, addressing that first point that, cleaning and understanding and working with the data from a data engineering perspective, I think is vitally, vitally important and sort of a necessary precondition to do any of the sophisticated and amazing work that we can do with ML and AI.
Sure.
And I think the other thing is the standard data models and the ability to normalize across these disparate sources and work with sort of common semantics and syntactic structures is key. But this is an evolving process.
Yeah, I was going to say, how realistic is it that there could be a common data model given the increasing variety? It's not getting smaller, these volumes of different data types and the formats they come in, structured, unstructured. You mentioned cleaning it, but that's a huge task in itself, quite resource intensive.
Absolutely. And I think frankly it's often overlooked because it's in
Mhm.
a lot of ways the least appealing element, but that data engineering, the monitoring, cleaning, and feature extraction and engineering work is I think actually the bulk of the challenge. And in investing in those best practices, architectures, and standards are really,
Yeah,
really key,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think, in laying a good, solid foundation. But it's important to bear in mind that as you establish those standards, uh, invariably you'll be working in a reality in which there isn't perfect standards adherence. It's a continual process, but at least if you have a North Star in architecture and best practices, you can, establish a framework and continually and iteratively improve and normalize the data structures.
yeah, yeah. Good point. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I mean, that wasn't the sum total of the challenges, that there's more still, and some of these follow on from things that we've already mentioned, but you know, that volume of data, the variety of sources of data, the uncleanliness of the data, at least when it arrives or flows across the server provider's network, how do you get visibility? How do you get that clear view of the data? I mean, visibility seems to be a huge challenge for operators, because without that visibility, understanding where the data's come from, what it means, what we can do with it, well, I don't know if it's dramatic to say it, but it kind of feels like it's almost unusable. So, that visibility is a key part again of the challenges.
Yeah, and I think also I one thing that's really key is that it's one thing to have visibility from a tactical perspective into a particular functional area, but I think the biggest challenge clearly is establishing uh, common visibility into relevant data across functional areas and dealing with these significant functional and organizational silos. So
Yeah,
you can break down the barriers and establish not only visibility into the data, but a strategic visibility where you have each functional area, whether it's field operations, operations, service operations, into the business, all working with a common view of the underlying data and able to work across these various silos of data. And I think that's where it really unlocks the massive value, not the tactical
absolutely.
problem solving.
Yeah, because presumably some of this data, can be utilized in different functions within the
Yes.
business. I mean, something that
Yeah.
I've seen in our research is the increasing value of network performance data in things like service monitoring, service creation, customer experience. You need
Exactly.
different functions in the business to be able to see this data to understand how they can utilize it, which kind of goes
Exactly.
back to that common data model, but also very much around that visibility map.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And frankly, I think from an operational perspective, it's critically important to understand the importance of that operational work to customer experience, to the business, and to strategic objectives, because it's of course interlinked. And from an operational perspective, being able to understand the impact, for instance, of network data and what it's telling you about network infrastructure on the network performance, and then from the network performance to customer experience. I mean, these things are
Mm.
critically important in terms of ensuring that as an organization, you're focused on the things that really matter for the business, from the
Yeah, yeah,
operational perspective up into strategic objectives. And
yeah,
frankly, I think the same applies from a network engineering and planning perspective in the achievement of efficiency goals, the achievement of sustainability goals for that matter. It's connecting the dots across those silos that I think is really, really critical.
yeah, absolutely. And I think it's easy to kind of overlook how ingrained those silos were within telcos. I think things are changing. I think, that there is, a growing awareness that those silos, whilst, they have a very clear view of their own functional area in a business, such as networks, for example, there is still some challenge in breaking down those silos and utilizing that data in other parts of the business. So it kind of leads me to one of the other points I was making about that data strategy or really data culture within the organization. And that really has to be driven from the top down, because it's okay for a network engineer saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if this data was available to our colleagues in other parts of the business? But you've got to have someone who's driving that through. So what do you see about data culture or data strategy in service providers? It seems to be becoming much more of a living, breathing part of strategic decision making.
Absolutely, yes. And I think it's a really interesting point, because I think that, more and more we have chief data officers, you have, strategic functions really focused on leveraging data in a consistent and a holistic fashion within companies. And I think that's absolutely critical to have that strategic, focus and support. However, it's sort of a balancing act, because I think it's equally important to engage and enable the subject matter experts and the people actually working with that data to solve problems in their particular domains. And it's also critical to adopt approaches which, though perhaps strategic and big picture oriented, can be actually executed in an iterative and agile fashion. So I think there's sort of this balancing act between the strategic direction and ensuring that the approach is adopted in a scalable and extensible manner in consistently across areas, but similarly employing tools and platforms which sort of democratize access to the data and analytics and frankly, ML and AI, and bring it to the business so that you avoid this other siloed phenomenon, which is the tendency to create data analytics organizations that exist as very highly specialized silos, especially with areas like machine learning and AI. So I think there's the strategic direction and support is critical, but also empowerment and enablement, a sort of democratization within organizations. And it's sort of a balancing act.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we've done some research into skill sets, for example, within telcos, particularly in the light of AI, and we'll get onto AI specifically in a minute. We're seeing, as you said, chief, data officers, chief insight officers being hired, those positions being created by CSPs, often recruiting from IT businesses from outside of telecom. But as you say, there can be that potential risk that you create a little enclave that speaks that IT language within the telco, but hasn't kind of taught everyone else that language. So, having a culture to proliferate that through the CSP is really important. Okay, something I probably should have mentioned at the top of today's webinar. If you do have questions for Matt or myself, please do use the Q&A facility on the webinar interface on Zoom, and we'll spare some time at the back end of the hour to run through as many of those as we can. Okay, next slide, please. And of course, no presentation or webinar would be complete without generative AI. So something we've done within the analyst team here is try to kind of scope out how we think, speaking to service providers, how they're going to be introducing generative AI. And what we saw is that it kind of breaks down into different flavors, if you like, different function areas within the business. And there's kind of some broad groups of Gen AI use case. What are you seeing, Matt, in terms of how operators are looking to introduce Gen AI? Is it sort of dipping the toe in the water, or have very firm plans? And if they do, are they realistic about how to bring those to bear? And what sort of things also need to be in place to really make that Gen AI strategy successful?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's abundantly clear is, all carriers are really keenly interested in AI, Gen AI specifically,
Yeah.
and are focusing a lot of attention, at least at a high level, on developing Gen AI strategies. I think that similarly, there's been fairly rapid adoption in some segments, like customer facing, customer service, chatbots, and that's been really amazing to see just how quickly that's taken hold and started to have real impact. I do think, though, that it's very, very early stages, and I think also it's worth remembering that there's a spectrum from Gen AI through machine learning and more traditional sort of domain-specific model training and application. And it's I think it's still very early stages in what I've seen, and there's very keen interest and some pretty aggressive adoption, but primarily in areas like chatbots, customer service, and now more and more in this sort of co-pilot model,
Right.
where maybe Gen AI is being leveraged in some domains, like field operations, network operations, but with a human in the loop and subject matter expert leveraging that co-pilot to as another tool in the tool bag. So
Yeah, absolutely. We're fascinated, of course, within TM Forum about some of these use cases because some of them are based on our own assets that have been created by the TM Forum with our community of operators and solution providers. And you know, what I'm kind of interested in how data plays into that sort of Gen AI strategy, because just listing some of the different potential use cases, and this is by no means kind of exhaustive. How do you kind of identify which are the right ones for you as a CSP? Because you can't do all of this all at once. So is there a sense in which data can kind of the data you have and how you're handling it can kind of lead you to the right use cases that are ones that are perhaps, the lower hanging fruit, should we say, rather than you try and pick a use case and then kind of reverse engineer the data that you need to make that happen.
right.
How do you see it, Matt?
Yeah, I think it's really a sort of an optimization function which has two key inputs. And the first is, of course, as you say, what data is available to work with, and specifically to our earlier discussion, where do you have that high value, high reliability data to feed in. The second question, though, is where do you have the greatest pain and the greatest opportunity to employ Gen AI, which is both about efficiency and cost reduction, but also greatest impact for your customers and for the service you're delivering. And I think as this slide makes abundantly clear, this is a target-rich environment. There's just so much to go after. I think in terms of adopting Gen AI, this really captures it beautifully, because from what I've seen so far, you have sort of low-hanging fruit and immediate opportunity in application to customer-facing in interaction, and it's like chatbots and personalization. I mean, there's just so much you can do relatively easily to improve the customer interface and experience, and also drive a lot of efficiencies within contact centers and support organizations, for instance.
Sure.
Then I think for the medium to long term, the potential with things like cloud native networking. I mean, it's incredible what I think is possible with the orchestration and automation capabilities with cloud native architectures combined with AI and frankly still ML to create things like autonomous networks and intelligent network services. But I think that that's something which will progress over time into the future. It's still, very, very early
Absolutely. Yeah,
stages.
and I think it's a good point. Some of these are, much simpler to deploy and have implementations of than others, but there's also an interrelation between a lot of these as well. So, whilst they can yield great benefits that kind of accumulate, they are also somewhat sort of thorny, entangled issues to clarify. So, back to our point about that need for a clear strategy and what you're trying to achieve, and is it an efficiency or is it improved customer experience? Is it saved cost? Have that clarity around why you're doing it.
Yep.
Okay, great. Next slide, please. So within our research, we ask some quite specific questions sometimes of the service providers we're speaking to. And we took one area of potential benefit or deployment of AI, and that was within IT operations, AI ops as it's sometimes referred to. And we asked them about some of the challenges of implementing AI for IT. And without going through all the different options within the question, data came out on top, but sadly not in a good way. You're not surprised to see that, Matt, the top challenge being
Not at all.
inconsistent, fragmented data, but also the second challenge as well, lack of data analytics expertise. Is that how you would expect the, service providers to be responding currently?
Absolutely. I think actually in a lot of ways it's reassuring to see this output because it rings very, very true. And I think quite frankly, oftentimes the data engineering infrastructure and the integration of data is perhaps has been underappreciated because again, the focus tends to be on this, the other end of the pipeline and the exciting things you can do with AI. But
Sure.
boy, if you don't solve for that underlying data architecture and integration to start with, it's pretty difficult to have an effective AI strategy overall. So I think that this rings very, very true. And it's actually, in my mind, good to see that there's an appreciation of this, the importance
Yeah.
of integrating the data and establishing a data platform that you can then
Yeah,
build.
and also that lack of data analytics expertise. I mean, there's
Yes.
kind of two appreciations in one there, the
Yep.
value of data analytics and the value of the expertise needed to really get the most out of that. But I think that also shows up well for solutions providers that are in partnership with operators. I think that there's that growing awareness that CSPs need those partners because that's where a lot of that expertise resides. And that's something Splunk have from outside of telecoms as well, isn't it, Matt?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I think that's the other key to all of this is, within telecoms, there is some very, very specific challenges around the support of massive networks and network delivered services. But really, more and more, this is about data, and it's about integrating fragmented data and bringing it to bear to understand what's happening with these delivery of services over infrastructure. And I think the sort of the principles, best practices, and architectures are really about the data and data management. With adaptation certainly to the particular needs of the telecom infrastructure. And the other thing that I think is really key is that more and more software and, for that matter, cloud native architectures are becoming relevant within both the traditional BSS and OSS realms with cloud native network architectures. So more and more, these worlds of IT and network are really colliding, and a lot of the principles applied within the IT context, I think now apply more and more broadly within
Yeah, it's interesting.
but,
I seem to recall that something we referred to in the report I mentioned at the top, at something the CTO of TM Forum, George Glass, refers to as netware skills.
yes,
That kind of network plus
yes,
software. And
yeah.
yeah, it's a rarer part of the Venn diagram than you might imagine, but it's becoming increasingly important. And
Yep.
we're seeing it not just in how telcos are recruiting, but how they're training internally and repurposing some of their engineering staff who understand networks, but
Mhm.
also to now use kind of IT and software models within that network domain. And it is all around how you use that data. Absolutely.
Yep. And
Okay.
and by the way, I would just add really quickly, I
Sure.
think you touched on something really, really critical, which is that this is a blending of worlds, but those network subject matter experts, the people who truly understand the problems you're trying to solve and the interpretation of the data involving those subject matter experts with people who perhaps come from a data software world, working together, that I think is really key. So, integrating across those sort of functional and expertise silos as well, I think is key.
Yes, it's something that I've heard mentioned to me that, oh, well, when we see mature autonomous networks, we won't need network engineers anymore. But I kind of think, well, we need them more than ever because the network is
Yeah,
so much more complex and they still
exactly.
have that physical layer, of course.
Yep.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next slide then, please. So we did also ask CSPs during some of our research, how successful they feel they've been in making a data available for AI and machine learning. This particular piece of data is taken from our recent Gen AI operator survey that we released at the back end of 2023. But, you can see on screen there, I know it's a little dense, but, quite a few feel that they're making very good progress. Some feel that they've really got quite a long way to go, and some are a little on the fence. But, also many feel, more than half, 63% feel they've got effective governance in place. And that's something we've not talked about quite so much, but it's still, another critical issue for data usage, particularly when we've got all these different disparate sources outside of the operator's control sometimes coming into the CSP. Um, do you feel CSPs are being quite successful in making data available, or what have they still got to do? I mean, there's some good progress here, but certainly some more progress to make, it would feel like.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of understanding the data available and understanding the need to bring these various silos together, there there's pretty good awareness, and I think there's sort of high level buy-in. I think where there's still a tremendous amount of work to be done is in uh, affecting those strategies and actually building the platforms that effectively integrate the data across the silos. It's one thing to have an understanding of what data you have available in the various silos. It's another to make it effectively available to build that data-centric architecture that effectively breaks down all those silos.
Mm.
And and I think the other thing that's really key here is governance and security and ensuring that those aspects are incorporated in the architecture and strategy so that as you break down those barriers and you do things, for instance, like take customer 360 and customer usage data and blend it with your network data and integrate it, it's extremely powerful. But you need to ensure, of course, that you're doing this in a way that leverages the value of that data while remaining fully compliant and secure and protecting what can be very, sensitive and data impacted by privacy regulations. So I think it's really key to get that basic framework in place that allows you to ensure that security and compliance as you're affecting these architectures.
Yeah.
So frankly, it's interesting to see the results because I think these are more positive than I would have expected. But I do think there's been, growing awareness and focus on this area, and we're seeing that in the results.
Yeah, I mean, these are the people that agreed to respond to the survey. Perhaps there were some that felt they had less positive, you know, a response to the question, so declined to be interviewed. But it's interesting what you're saying about compliance there, because there were some, out of those conversations, some genuine concerns raised about Gen AI. I mean, much as we talk about the positives of it, there are still some issues that need to be considered. And you mentioned the legal risks around compliance, security, of course, but there are a few others as well around, hallucinations within the data, inaccurate kind of usage of data, or even fraudulent usage of data. And then costs as well. It's something we haven't really talked about. We're talking about huge scale, potentially massive amount of data being utilized by AI, processing costs and so on. Is that a concern that you think is growing, or operators beginning to sort of touch the brakes a little bit on AI strategy because of cost concerns?
Yeah, I think it's early stages, but already there's increasing awareness of the actual, the costs associated with the use of these techniques. And yeah, I think that's inevitable as you move forward and things become more real and are executed at scale. The cost side of the equation becomes increasingly apparent. And to me, I think this really harkens back to a key principle too, which is to understand the problem that you're solving and the value of the problem you're solving, so that you can place those associated costs in context, and ensuring that you're employing AI focused on solving the problems that are worth the implied effort and cost. And that I think in the early stages there was sort of this urgency to employ AI, and then Gen AI as a key requirement. And really it should be, okay, focus on the problems that are most important to the business, and as you say, find those sort of low-hanging fruit opportunities where we have the data, it's in a state that we can use, and we can bring it, to Gen AI to solve for things that drive real value. And then those costs are clearly a factor, become just a factor in the equation with the value that far exceeds the cost.
Yeah,
I think
and
early
it's a
stage.
reasonable point, isn't it? Because much as there are great benefits, there is an investment here. We are talking about investing in new technologies. Well, if we could have the next slide, please. I mean, maybe I'll dig a little bit more into those kind of clusters of Gen AI use case. We have talked about this a little bit already, so I won't labor the point. But there are so many different potential use cases, and some of them will play off each other, and there is kind of rationalization needed by operators. And to your point, it's about focusing on what you're trying to get out of Gen AI that kind of leads you perhaps to look in certain areas sooner, where your biggest problems are, or where the biggest potential yields might be. And then, as we were discussing, having data kind of tell you a little bit about what's achievable, what data you have, and what you can use. Where do you get involved as Splunk in discussions with CSPs around potential Gen AI use cases? At what point do you get brought into the conversation? And without specific customer naming, kind of frame that a little bit for us, Matt.
Yeah, so I think it's a conversation we're having really across the board, across the industry. And I think that really we're getting engaged both at a sort of a strategic roadmap planning perspective, but then also a very, very sort of tangible, tactical, we have this data, we're using Splunk, we have this, particular problem we're trying to solve. How can we bring Gen AI to bear to help solve for that?
Yeah.
And so it's, both that sort of tactical and immediate engagement and more of the, strategic roadmap engagement. And it's interesting because I think that very much as you see on the slide, you have uh, a wide range in terms of the use cases and across multiple domains. And one of the areas where we've seen a tremendous amount of use and a tremendous amount of value, uh, you know, really, really, I think sort of low-hanging fruit is in that customer operations, things like contact center and chatbots. I mean, it's driving a lot of value with relatively low effort, but we're having discussions and engaged across, a roadmap that I think includes a lot of other domains and a lot of other interesting use cases.
Yeah, and I think customer operations certainly feels to us from our discussions that that's been a really important kind of validation of Gen AI. It's been that early success domain, if you like, for a lot of operators that have implemented it. Found it, if not painless, then relatively so, and certainly far outweighed by the value that it's already beginning to show. And I think it's been very encouraging to them to then want to say, okay, well, what else? What's next? How else do we use it?
Yep. And,
You know,
and I think one other really key contextual consideration as well is that really there's a range. I mean, Gen AI is clearly, where the focus is now and, new transformative technology, but there's also a whole suite of capabilities around AI ops, and machine learning with, domain-specific trained models. And I think really there's a tremendous amount of value and opportunity across that full range of
mm,
machine learning and AI capabilities. And so oftentimes
absolutely.
they find that, okay, we're working with our partners and with service providers identifying Gen AI opportunities, but there's also a tremendous amount to be realized with more traditional AI ops and machine learning capabilities.
Absolutely. I'm going to run through a few examples in just a moment, but if we could just have the next slide first of all. So this is just looking at one of those areas that was on the previous slide, one of those kind of broad groups of use case. But then you kind of break it down and you find that there's so many more within that kind of area that could be applicable. So we're just looking at specifically network automation. And to your point that you're just making, Matt, I think as networks move into whatever 6G might be, I think AI would be much more hard baked into whatever set of standards may emerge next. But at the moment, in kind of 5G and optical fiber kind of networks that we have, we're kind of almost backfilling AI into some of those networks to try and increasingly automate them to then leverage other capabilities, as it were. But without going through all these on screen, you can see, a rich variety of things, all of which, have real value to customers in terms of experience, have real value to the business in terms of efficiencies and cost savings. Um, you know, but really, the point I also want to make is the value of analytics, that kind of looping round of data within the organization, and that's a key part of the whole math, if you like, to ensure the formula continues to feed off itself and grow and learn. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think you touched on probably the
I've
most
answered my own
critical.
question.
Yeah. Well, but the feedback loops,
Yeah.
I think, are absolutely critical. And from what I've seen with, the application of machine learning, AI, just the ability to rapidly validate the model results and recommendations, and then tweak and tune and adjust. And engaging subject matter experts, the people who understand the problems that are being solved in that process is key. So I think that's probably the most important principle I've seen is, first, at least initially, starting with a human in the loop mode, where your, AI capabilities are working in concert with humans, and then also building the mechanisms for continual evaluation and refinement of those model-driven capabilities, so that you fully understand, and this is another data problem in and of itself, understanding the validity and the impact of those AI processes so that you can continually evaluate and refine. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about this is that specifically within network automation, with the adoption of cloud native architectures, you're unlocking as well the rich real-time data streams needed to effectively feed AI-driven capabilities. And you're also enabling orchestration capabilities, which then allow automation and the ability to do more closed loop execution, which I think ultimately is the most exciting transformative capability, but something that will develop, I think, over time.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Okay, well, let's quickly run through a few examples that I've uncovered through recent research, just to share with you some examples of that kind of data-driven strategy in different manifestations within operators. So take the next slide, please. Before I launch into these, perhaps just one last reminder that we are open for questions in a couple of minutes. If you do have any, please do share those with us. So one of those examples was, I've put it on screen as Orange Smart NOC, but actually it's a pretty holistic transformational strategy that Orange has undertaken, not just to drive its various networks, because it has around 25 different network holdings across Europe and Africa, but to drive those networks to AN level 4, to revitalize its NOC operations and also its service management center. It's overhauled its BSS and billing operations, and it's really started with that cloud native architecture that we were talking about earlier, but really with a view to saying, look, we don't want to just dip our toe in the water with use cases. We want to put everything in place so that we can really kind of accelerate adoption and evolution of those use cases and learn so much more. So, this was probably the kind of most all-encompassing example, really a very brave one, but it took, quite a detailed kind of breakdown of that data structure into different domains. So the network domain group has undergone its own assessment of where it is currently, where there's shortfalls, how they kind of build a roadmap and model those phases of AN maturity, and then what that means to other parts of the business in terms of utilization of network data for customer service, for service operations, and so on. So I felt this was a really strong example of that, but very much a kind of, one of the industry leading examples of really embracing data in a very all-encompassing way. Next slide, please. This one was another example of kind of an operational overhaul, and this was undertaken by Hong Kong Telecom. Very, very competitive market, and for Hong Kong Telecom, it was really important to maintain that competitive edge. It's a limited market in terms of population size, but quite a sophisticated user base in terms of their understanding of services and technologies. But on the flip side of that, quite a critical user base. When they see faults and issues, they're not at all shy in getting on to their operator to let them be aware of that. So it was somewhat reactive to begin with, but then kind of as that transformational process accelerated, I think Hong Kong Telecom realized there was so much more they could do. both on the network side, leveraging digital twins to understand how the network was working, but in the service domain as well, using LLM to kind of really dig into user behavior and then marry the two together to understand where customer service has been diminished because network performance was experiencing issues. And it's put in place autonomous agents and co-pilots, as we were saying, to kind of minimize the impact on the customer when there were periods of service outage or network issues and so on. So again, I think this is a really good example of turning what used to be a very telco-centric operational problem around a network component being out and really thinking commercially in terms of, well, how do we leverage that to give back to the customer? If we can't, you know, improve the experience right now, we can at least be minimizing the impact. We can message the customer saying, yes, part of the network's experiencing an issue, but we'll be back full service very quickly. And I think, you know, if you're a customer, you can accept that somewhat. You are aware that the operator is at least dealing with the problem and has acknowledged that there is one. So I felt that was a really important one. Last slide, please, and then we'll take a couple of questions. This was from AIS, which is an operator in Thailand that's really trying to put data at the heart of its sort of transformational strategy, with the ambition of being what it describes as a cognitive techco, sorry, not telco, cognitive techco, to really kind of leverage its digital assets and services to create a different type of experience for its customer. But the reason I put that down, and I'm just going to refer to my notes here, is because in their conversations with us, they've referred to data and some of the learnings that they've had, and maybe I can bring you in on this. So they've noted that data convergence is really the first step in digital transformation, and that access to better quality data drives that virtuous circle and more proactive customer care, which I think is you know, the point you were making earlier, Matt. So nice examples that show that operators are grappling with some of this and seeing good outcomes.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And connecting that customer experience with the underlying operational data, and also doing this with that converged data platform as you know, a platform in a standard architecture as your foundation, I think is key.
Okay, very good. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through this very quickly. In fact, I think I'll skip it because I want to preserve a bit of time for questions. This is something that is in the report I referred to, something that we always try to put in a few top takeaways, as it were. But maybe we can chat around that as we take a couple of questions. So I'll take the next slide, please, and we'll open up for Q&A. So one question that I want to ask, Matt, is, you know, what does a CSP do to improve its data quality? What sort of mechanisms or solutions does it put in place?
Yeah, and I think the key thing is to pull the data together into a platform, which then makes it available to the business and then allows you to institute not only the processes, visualization, automation from that data, but also allows you to actively monitor your data pipelines and understand how that data processing is functioning, how it's driving your business. So I think the number one key principle in my mind is that converged data architecture, which allows you to understand your data flows and the data value, and most importantly, continually process, clean, integrate, and work with that data in an extensible, open manner. Without that, very difficult to drive the value and to create operationally supportable approaches leveraging that data.
Okay. Next question is around sustainability and is about how CSPs can leverage data to ensure sustainability is kind of built into efficiencies. You know, how do they How can they go about that?
Yeah, I think this is one of the most exciting aspects is the same way you drive network optimization and efficiency from a cost perspective. Now, carbon footprint and sustainability goals can be optimized in the same manner using a lot of the same data. And frankly, you can solve for both to a significant degree by reducing energy consumption, reduce OpEx, and reduce that carbon footprint. So incorporating sustainability as an operational sort of high priority aspect, I think is key. We really have
Okay.
to wrap it together
Yeah.
and understand how it relates to customer experience. So you can drive optimal customer experience with greatest efficiency and minimal carbon footprint.
Yeah, good point. And last question, in terms of creating that data-centric strategy and culture within the organization, what do you think are the kind of major steps along the way? I mean, it sounds like the principles are agreed and accepted within telcos, but not necessarily the kind of roadmap to building that within the organization.
Yeah, and I think the key is having that high-level executive support and a standard approach in terms of best practices and platform, but then democratizing the access to the data. So each of those functional areas begins to work with their data and understand their impact on other organizational areas. So I think it's both the high level kind of strategic, best practices and platform, but then engagement in a democratized fashion across those various domains. And it's a process. It needs
Of
to
course.
evolve over time. And understanding how the work that every team does relates to the strategic objectives of the business, I think is key.
Okay. Thanks very much, Matt. Sadly, we're out of time, but thank you so much for your input. I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Going to wrap up the webinar there. It is going to be archived and available on demand for people who aren't able to join us in real time. The slides, the white paper report that we mentioned at the top of the webinar will also be available too. So, Matt, thank you again for joining us and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and we're going to draw the webinar to a close. Thank you and good day.
Yes. Thank you.
Cheers.